Hey everybody, my name is Ian and today we're talking about Brendan A. Galipeau's A Tibetan Catholic Christmas in China, Ethnic Identity and Encounters with Ritual and Revitalization. This is a really fascinating article about syncretism, about how there's sort of two ways of thinking about how customs develop and how customs are practiced. And typically, of course, as we always talk about in folklore, things are always being made new, even with the sense that there is a continuity with the past and a not an imperative that comes from without, but the group's sense that one of the ways that we should do things is in keeping with the way it was done before, and an impulse, particularly because it is celebratory, because it is about identity, because it is about sort of consistency with the past. There's a desire to be somewhat conservative in one's choices. And so we continue things as they were before. But we're influenced. We're influenced not simply by a single strand, but we live in complex worlds. We live in complex contexts, and we live in multiple groups. And a cynic can see a tradition, can see a people, can see an ethnicity, and then note that it has been influenced by something else, and see that as some kind of devolution, some kind of weakening somehow of the tradition. And or we can think of things syncretically. We can think of things as creative combinations where people whose identities are already, I want to say bifurcated, but that's not quite the right word because that almost sounds like split, but whose identities are multiple, whose identities are in that both and, they creatively take elements from both and they create something new, so that someone who is perhaps only partially identified with that can see consistency and yet see difference at the same time. So Galipeau is talking about this community in southern Tibet called Zhejiang, and it has been Catholic since the 1850s. It was originally when French missionaries came to to missionize, as missionaries are wont to do. They didn't get too far into the interior of Tibet and some of the high country, but they were able to successfully have a mission. After about 50 years, some of the hardcore Buddhists actually drove them out, and violently drove them out. But nevertheless, local community rebuilt a church, re-invited, at least in Zhejiang. So the larger mission had failed, but in Zhejiang, locals were still involved in Catholicism, and they started rebuilding a church. And the French came back, and they were helped by some Swiss missionaries. Oh, that's a difficult two-word combination to say. And they rebuilt a church. And then they were expelled in 1952. And there wasn't any priest there until 2008. However, in the 1980s, there was a growing movement to basically, for China, to open up and allow certain forms of religious observance in what had prior to that been a fairly severe crackdown on religious observance within the communist state. Galipeau is clear to point out that this particular area of Tibet doesn't have the same fraught relationship with China as the rest of Tibet, and he's sort of conspicuously quiet about the political ramifications of Tibet. The role of the Dalai Lama, the Free Tibet movement, and all those sorts of things. He sort of gives mention of it, but that isn't his concern in this immediate area, so he doesn't talk about it. It's good to mention it, even if it's, again, not particularly relevant to his case. When we think Tibet and China, we think of these sort of odd, we think of the tensions that are reported back to us, and those tensions are real, and those tensions should be heated, and civil rights and human rights should be heeded. That just isn't the area of this particular part of Tibet, because we can't think oversimplified in terms of one identity for an entire region. So in 2008, there was a priest actually came, but people had been practicing Catholicism and practicing their Christianity vernacularly. Basically, they were keeping, even if the masses that they were celebrating were official because they didn't have an official priest there, they were doing Catholicism, and they were doing it as both Catholics and as Tibetans. And so he describes the Christmas that he witnessed in 2014. And since the priest arrived, but even starting even earlier, what had happened is that in the late 1990s, the region had turned to tourism and cultural tourism and environmental tourism. I think he calls it landscape tourism, as a potential economic boost, because logging had collapsed. So now we have a region that is very similar to what's happened in the American South. It's similar to what happened in Cape Breton. It's similar to what happened to the north of England. It's similar to what happened to so many places where industry has collapsed and tourism has taken on a new salvific role for economic surety. So he describes the Christmas in 2014. And it's a lovely description. And it's 2 days. Basically, it's Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And Christmas Eve, they get together. People start going into the church and they're cleaning and start to decorate. And they decorate it in a way that's actually would be quite familiar to Western Christians as well. They've got statues of Mary and Joseph flanking the altar. They've got a statue of the baby Jesus over top the altar. They have Christmas trees, and they have Christmas trees that are a local variant, a local pine tree, not necessarily the North American style pine tree, but a local pine tree, and they are actually present and in the church throughout the year. But they are redecorated and particularly lit up for Christmas. There are strings of lights. There's a nativity scene that's laid out. So all these elements that are rather consistent. He's good to point out that one of the things that Christianity has, and as much as it has hegemonically imposed much on as part of the colonial exercise, has imposed regulation of religious belief and adherence and codes of morality that are old and crusty and binary and Manichaean and hate the body and are misogynist and all that. Nevertheless, one of the ways that they have done it in successfully is by actually already being a fairly syncretic religion. So if you think about how Christmas is performed around the world, particularly, again, those are the more festive occasions, the Christmas Mass itself, I mean, that's a Mass. It's structured. It's coming from the central authority of the Vatican. We're talking about Catholicism specifically, not Christianity in general. But the vernacular celebrations, the narratives that go alongside the Christian narrative of Christmas. So the Santas, the Bafanas, the Sinterklauses. You have all these stories. The aesthetics of it. The sort of Victorian Christmas tree, the red and green of North American, the Santa Claus stories, and all of that, they remarkably can incorporate it. So Christmas is a ridiculously successful holiday and has entered into, it's probably one of the most successful Christian holidays that has really fundamentally become a secular holiday as well. Not simply in terms of the secularization that you see in North America, but how Christmas is celebrated in Japan, particularly, where it is an important holiday, but it is not a religious holiday by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a very vibrant celebratory tradition, and it has nothing to do with the nativity narrative. So going back, they decorate the church, and then they have a mass on the Sunday, on the Christmas Eve night. The evening of Christmas Eve, and it's nice and well attended, and the church is full. So the mass is standard, a reasonably standard Catholic mass. It's celebratory, happy, like many of the Christmas masses are, replete with Tibetan chanting. So it's already on the level of language, it's syncretic. And of course, since Vatican II, Catholicism uses local language, but it's not simply using Tibetan words, it is chanting, it is using Tibetan musical styles to accompany it. It's more elaborate than the masses that are normally than the normal weekly masses. It's very ornate, and in part it's because it is so well attended. These are the only Catholic. This is the only priest within the vicinity, but still travel would be an issue. So all the Catholics around are attending this, but also all the Buddhists are attending this. So many Buddhists attended, and because not as a religious festivity, but because of the role that Christmas is able to play in this community as fundamentally a local social festival. The Buddhists don't have lamas nearby, and they don't have sort of an official priesthood either. So this becomes one of their opportunities for conviviality, for all the things that Christmas can do, a social function. He also points out that this is not a celebration that takes place in the home. This is a public festival. There's no Christmas celebrations in the home. And not no in terms of as if it's verboten. It's just that isn't part of the equation. This is something that people gather together and do. So there's a mass on the I keep on calling it the Saturday when I really mean the Christmas Eve. And then there's another mass on the Sunday. People are dressed in Tibetan clothes with Santa hats. Children are processing in these kind of clothes. And so again, it's this very specific mix, not simply of Tibetan and mainstream religious Catholic, but North American secular Christmas as well. The Mass is done in, the songs for the Mass are traditional Catholic hymns translated into Tibetan, as had been done by the missionaries, the French and the Swiss missionaries, prior to when they were expelled in 1952. Meanwhile, the Mass is being done in Mandarin because the priest is he's Han Chinese, and the scripture is being read out of a Mandarin text. So you've got a multiplicity of you've got two languages and this sort of Western religious festival, as it were. And then in the afternoon, Christmas Day, it's a social festival. Everyone gathers in the courtyard. There's singing, there's dancing, there's drinking. In a room adjacent, there's food, and the entire community eventually sort of shuffles through and has basically Chinese food at that time. And it is, it's celebratory. It's festive, and everyone is gathering together. And the important groups there are the local Catholics, the local Buddhists, so basically the entire community. And this town is 80% Catholic. Local Buddhists and people from the environs, so not simply from this town, but from this region getting together. And then there's also tourists and there's academics. And one of the things that's happened is that when in the late 90s, tourism became this industry, and they reframed this place, or reframed an immediately neighboring region as Shangri-La after the James Hilton book, and the sort of paradise on earth. And so reframing it in order to have the tourist gaze be cast upon it. And because you have the attraction of tourists, and you have the attraction of the academy, you have the attraction of people like Galipeau himself, and a whole host of other anthropologists, and whether they are Chinese or whether they are international anthropologists, they're coming. It's a significant enough group in size to be noted by Galipeau, saying how many people are coming as sort of the anthropological aspect of this. And again, you can look at it cynically. You can say basically this has become a tourist celebration, and people are aware that tourism is an industry, and taking the culture and turning it into something that is potentially on the level of spectacle, something that they know is going to be observed. Well, that you can be very cynical and say, well, then are they doing it for their own purposes? Galipeau isn't taking that tack, because he's not taking that tack because it seems the people he's talking to don't take that tack. That what they see, because their multiple identities that we talked about are kind of fraught, because they are Catholic in Tibet, and so they have that notion that they get that sense that other Tibetans, who are primarily Buddhist, imagine them to be practicing some foreign religion, so that they are not real Tibetan. Aspersions are being cast on them. And they're Tibetan and not Chinese. So they have that kind of not integration with that. And again, this community doesn't have the same, this part of Tibet doesn't have the same tensions with the rest of China that other parts of Tibet do. And so it's like, so they can't participate. They're not Chinese, so they don't do the Chinese New Year. They're not Buddhists, so they don't do the Buddhist observations. They're kind of in this betwixt and between. And now they have the ability, and they've had the ability for years in private and through their own efforts. And then they've had the ability, now that there's a priest, through the recognition of like an institutional recognition, but also therefore a religious thing, with religious recognition in terms of, well, there's actually someone who is ordained, and so I do have that mediator towards the divine. So there's a greater recognition, presumably by the divine, him or herself, of their practice. They have greater and greater ability to practice. Then they have whatever interventions are there by the state in terms of directing attention towards it. And now they have witnesses. And so now they have, in a way, by having the tourists there and by having the academics there, not only is there the benefit of the injection of tourist dollars, which is something that you don't want to dismiss, but it really, when people are coming to witness the celebration, it validates the celebration. It's like other people are seeing this. Other people find this interesting. This isn't something only weird. It might be peculiar for them, but it's not a peculiar that's an oddity or a peculiar that's like a freak show. It's a peculiar that is what a wonderful manifestation, what a wonderful aspect of syncretism that we're seeing. And so there's a creative tension that's there. One of the things he points to is that these aren't simply tourists from overseas, although there are French tourists and there are Taiwanese tourists who are, without starting up another third rail in terms of Chinese geopolitics, outsiders to China. There are Europeans who come and visit this, but particularly French because of the historic French connection to this place. There's also urban Chinese, and he mentions this idea of internal Orientalism, which is a neat thing to think about. Orientalism is a theory, is a term that proposed by Edward Said, who is Palestinian and by birth, and he was talking about the impulse among the privileged West, so Western Europe and America, to be fascinated with the East, using that idea of the Orient. Not more so than simply the connotation of the Latin in terms of East, but all the mystic notion that Orient might suggest. So anywhere from the Near East to the Middle East to the Far East. And this fascination that started, let's just say, there are vestiges of it throughout time, really, but let's just say starting in the early 19th, late 18th centuries, about the time of Napoleon, but all through the long 19th century, this fascination with Egypt, this fascination with the Middle East, with ancient Babylon, with Jerusalem, fascination with India, fascination with China, which extended to, and fascination with Japan extended to things like Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado and so on. That which was based in turn on an exhibit at the Royal Museum on Japanese artifacts, and this. We can also just briefly mention how many artifacts were stolen and brought to London, and then also brought to the United States, and so on. So just putting a pin in that for a second. But this awe that is felt towards the time depth of the traditions that come from the East, as opposed to what's happening in the West, in the sense that the West is sort of lacking in gravitas in terms of its traditions. Simultaneously, however, and this is where it becomes not simply this, oh, isn't the East cool? But simultaneously, by finding so much reverence for the ancient and the time depth of those traditions, they're simultaneously keeping them in that past, and they're sort of keeping them away, through the through not simply the powers that privilege have, but the powers that state violence and the powers that colonialism has, that keep these actors from having keep these the contemporary people of these regions from being actors on the world stage. It's like, fundamentally, this is an oversimplification of Orientalism. Your glory days are in the past. We love your glory days. They're awesome. We're going to come visit your glory days. Have no fear, but you can't sit at the big boys' table. Orientalism kind of has that, and so he's talking about this internal Orientalism, where you have the middle class urban Chinese who are kind of dissatisfied with contemporary urban Chinese life, and are looking for some kind of authentic tradition, and become just enamored with Tibet and enamored with these ancient traditions and these folk traditions and so on, which does introduce that little bit of problematic. And it's the same thing you see whenever you have a privileged power speaking about the wonderful past of particular places. I've always felt that you can apply Orientalism as a concept to Atlantic Canada, and particularly places like Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton, in terms of, the depth of culture, the wonderful history that you have there, and then sort of like, yeah, but you're not really modern people, so we can nevertheless continue your exploitation from central Canada. That doesn't make me popular at dinner parties when I say that, though, so I usually keep it at bay. So I just think ultimately this is a fascinating article, in part because, once more, it emphasizes the nature of calendar custom it illustrates two things. One, it illustrates these concepts of syncretism as dynamic, in that, a quick overview of seeing people in Tibetan dress and Santa hats. You see the pictures, and you might go, because it's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, and it's kind of amusing at first. And then it's like, no, these are people who are taking the elements that are both ancient and modern, that are both local and global, and all of which are meaningful for them, and creating something that has that reaffirms their sense of self, reaffirms their sense of identity. And it is cyclic. And it is, because it's Christmas and because it's midwinter and dark, and it doesn't necessarily make for a good time for work and harvesting and so on. It's just a good time to sort of shut off everything and get together and celebrate. They don't do it on the level of family. He points out that, unlike in other places, certainly in terms of the privileged West, the thick West, you have, Christmas is focused on family and consumerism, and here it's really focused on community. It's this gathering together. So we might think of Christmas as fundamentally something that's celebrated in the home, and then through decorations, and maybe through masses if you continue to have a religious identity. Maybe it's a collective experience, and Christmas parties and so on. But it's first and foremost in the home. And no, this is first and foremost in the community. In fact, this is basically exclusively in the community. And it's a community that is built on this sense of regional identity that is informed by Catholicism, that Catholicism does not exhaust the regional identity. First of all, it isn't applied to everybody in the region. And secondly, it's also Tibetanism, and South Tibetan, different from other places. And this becomes one of the few times that the community gathers together virtually as a whole, and like all calendar customs, reaffirms its continuity in place, reaffirms itself through performance, reaffirms itself through food and dance and song and just joyous, embodied communitas gathering, collective joy. And the fact that it is of interest to the academic, the fact that it is of interest to the tourist, gives them a sense of validation for it as well. It's like, and the tourist and the academic are welcome to not simply observe, but to join, because it isn't, even though it is a local festival of identity, it is not exclusionary. And one of the reasons it's, or one of the ways that it is not exclusionary is that it is joyous. And joy and exclusion do not necessarily go well. So it's a wonderful article. It does everything that you want. And it's a great illustration of syncretism. It's a great illustration of thinking of, again, most of the people who are watching this are probably located in the West and are pretty fluent with Western Christmas. And it's interesting seeing it in these different contexts. And because so much of it would probably be familiar to you, and even if you're not a Christmas celebrant, you virtually have a passing fluency with it by being in the North American or Western European context. It's accessible for those who don't have that, but for those who do, you go, oh wow, what's going on there? And it just hammers home this way that every year people gather together, or every cycle people gather together, and through symbol, through action, through text, sometimes through the texts of officialdom, sometimes through local texts, sometimes through both. And then through other sensory experiences, music, dance, smell, touch, taste, embrace. They reaffirm their relationships with each other and their definitions that are perhaps in contrast, but not necessarily in opposition to those not present. All right. Simple, straightforward, but yet wonderfully rich article is Brendan A. Galipeau's A Tibetan Catholic Christmas in China, Ethnic Identity and Encounters with Ritual and Revitalization. My name is Ian. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.